Good evening. Once heard someone say years ago that the only thing more neglected than singles is the third verse of a 4-verse song in the church. But now that we've got overhead, we never skip the third verse, so I'm not sure what that means for our singles. But I do think it is something that is true, that this was by request that we talk about single Christians tonight. And when I was first asked about it, I was thinking, well, it wasn't that long ago. I think that I did a lesson on that. And so I went back and looked at my notes, and it was 2017. Yes. And so some of those that are now requesting this lesson were in their early teenage years when the first time I did it. So they probably didn't pay any attention to it then, and it means a whole lot more to them now. Brother John gave me a really good introduction by saying, since this doesn't pertain to him, he's just going to sleep tonight. But as we talk about single Christians, one thing that I do want to say from the very, very beginning is we are so very sorry and apologetic to any of our singles if you feel like you've been neglected. That's never the intention, I don't think, of any of God's people. And yet it is something that does end up happening because it is so easy and so practical to talk about families and talk about relationships and to talk about how it is in a family and how it's supposed to be, that sometimes singles may get overlooked. There's a couple of days in our year where we talk about fathers and we talk about mothers in particular. And sometimes the singles feel very left out by that. And so tonight I want us to think about singles, a single Christian, and understand that just because a person is unmarried does not mean that they are incomplete. It is something that in 1 Corinthians 7 is actually portrayed as being, as Paul terms it, is something that's really a blessing because of the freedom that you have that others may not. And so as we go through this lesson, I hope it is not only encouraging for those that are the unmarried, but also those of us who are, that we need to be paying more attention and that we need to be more attentive and that we need to be encouraging for our young or for any among us that are among the unmarried. In the Talmud, it says that he who reaches the age of 20 and has not married spends all his days in sin. I mean, that's a horrible statement when you think about it. That he who reaches the age of 20 and has not married spends all his days in sin. And sometimes I think that's the impression that maybe we lead, is that if a person has not married that there is and had children, that there's somehow shame involved in that. And that's not at all what God has to say in His Word. When you go through 1 Corinthians 7, you may want to place your marker there in 1 Corinthians 7, and as we go through this chapter, realize that there are some unique circumstances that are going on. As you remember, 1 Corinthians is written to the brethren in Corinth, and is addressing a host of different problems and difficulties that they are having. And one of the problems that they are having is not just the idea of division because of spiritual gifts that we mentioned this morning. It's not just a division because they are listening to and following after certain teachers and they're very, very fleshly and carnal, but also because of the fact that some of them who have become Christians are also married to those who are not Christians. And in that situation, some of them are being left behind by their spouses who don't want to be under the same weight of persecution that the Christian is. And because of that, Paul has to address them and let them know what their situation is and their status is, not just in their marriages, but also if they're considering being married. And what if someone wants to betroth their child to someone else? Should we do that right now, with as bad as things are? Because people were being persecuted and not just made fun of, but put to death. And so this was a very real issue and very real problem. And when 1 Corinthians 7 is being penned by the Apostle Paul, the apostle of our Lord, gives some advice, some inspired advice about that situation and the way in which it should be handled. So tonight we are going to be spending a good bit of time in 1 Corinthians 7, and we're going to look at it from Paul's perspective, especially from that chapter. So if you're ready for your 3 key words, let's see the notebooks tonight. Okay, here we are. Devotion, availability, and influence. I don't remember the exact word that Ben's version used, but it has that idea of being able to be wholly devoted, particularly devoted to the things of God, because you're free from distractions. You're able to get your full attention to the things of the Lord. Availability means that you are more available than someone else would be. The married person has other responsibilities and other things that's going on in his life that make it to where he has to meet his other God-given responsibilities and may not be as available as someone who is unmarried to meet the task of the day. And also influence. That when you go through the scriptures, there's a lot of individuals. You go through the Old Testament, you can see there's a lot of prophets that were not married or at least not mentioned as being married. that you have young Timothy. And young Timothy seems to be someone that it never mentions him being married, but it talks about the kind of influence that he has upon the brethren and the example that he sets. We have a really good group of young people, and our really good group of young people are really good. They do get involved, and they are active, and they're engaged in a lot of different ways. We need to encourage that, because as they grow older, those are things that they may not be able to do as much of if they get married or if they start to have children. And because of that, these are some years that you can spend because you are available, and you can set the influence of a good example in the midst of that. We need to understand that there's a lot of different reasons why some people are not married. One of them is that it's something that some people just don't desire to marry. There are some who do not seem to have any interest in getting married. And from the outset, we need to understand that getting married is not a command. God does not demand it of us anywhere. It is something that a person chooses to do, and they need to be able to engage in it and choose it wholeheartedly. But it is a truth that there are some people who do not even desire to marry. And the marriage should not be pushed or belittled. For those in the audience who, how should I put this? You think you're Cupid, let's put it that way, and you like to be a matchmaker. You need to be real careful about that. Because some people don't desire to marry. Some people don't want to marry. Some people are not looking to get married. So just be real careful about it. Because for some people, it may be that you're invading in some personal territory where you really shouldn't be. Because when we think about those who are not married, we're not just talking about people who are young and they're at that age where it may be that they can marry, but it can also be those who have lost a spouse, or those who have lost a spouse through divorce. And because of that, they don't have that right. And so butting in too much can be very, very dangerous. So just a word of caution to be very careful about that. The church is not supposed to be a breeding ground for matchmakers, because we can become busybodies if we're not careful. Okay, so some people don't desire to marry. Another thing is, and this is what we see here in 1 Corinthians 7 as well, is that time and circumstances may not be right. Look at 1 Corinthians 7 and back up from our reading just a little bit to verses 25 through 27. 1 Corinthians 7, verses 25 through 27. Here Paul says, "Now concerning virgins, I have no commandment from the Lord, yet I give judgment as one whom the Lord in his mercy has made trustworthy." So here we have some advice from Paul, but it is, we need to understand, inspired divine advice. It's almost as if Paul is saying that Jesus did not say these things, but if he were to talk about these things, this is what he would be saying. "I suppose, therefore, that this is good because of the present distress, that it is good for a man to remain as he is. Are you bound to a wife? Do not seek to be loosed. Are you loosed from a wife? Do not seek a wife. But even if you do marry, you have not sinned, and if a virgin marries, she has not sinned. Nevertheless, such will have trouble in the flesh, but I would spare you from these things." In verse 29, again, Paul says this, "But this I say, brethren, the time is short, so that from now on, or in the time that remains, even those who have wives should be as those who have none." So what Paul is pointing to is that time and circumstances may not be right. It may be that you need to get things in your career started. It may be that you need to get financially stable in some ways. It's not necessarily that those things are the determining factor with that, but there's a lot of things that go on in a person's life that make it to where it may not be the right time. Here, Paul is saying that it may not be the right time for some of you to get married. Now, he says, now, if you do get married, you haven't done anything that's wrong. You haven't sinned in any way. But because of what's going on, because of the present distress, I believe that it's probably better for you to remain as you are. And you may not be in the state that you want to be in. There may have been some who wanted to be married at that time, or wanted to be betrothed at that time, or maybe even some that wanted to be loosed at that time. Whatever it was that was going through. Paul's not giving a license for doing something that's sinful or wrong. But what he's saying is, from this time forward, you need to be acting as if you're single, because you don't know how bad things are about to become. And these things are going to get so horrible that you may be tested to choose your loyalty between your spouse and the Lord. And the Lord comes first. And that's a decision that's hard to make when you are bound to someone else. So time and circumstances may just not be right for some people. It may also be that some people have not found that right person. We were kind of joking earlier, right before the sermon, about, if it were so easy, you just go down the street and say, I'm going to baptize you, you're going to be a faithful Christian, this time next year we're going to get married. It's not that easy. And some people have a hard time finding the right person. As you know, some of the marriage statistics are sort of alarming. Well, not sort of, they are very alarming in our country, because there's less and less people who are getting married. And the birth rate is not what it needs to be for a sustainable society, as they say. And so we need to be cognizant of that in our lives. However, don't just go out and find someone just to fulfill that quota. That's not what marriage is supposed to be about. And so some people have not found the right person. There's also some people who cannot. Remember, last week we talked about marriage, divorce, and remarriage. And some people do find themselves in a situation where they are not eligible. They are not authorized to get married because they've been put away, or because they are outside of a marriage that they put someone else away in an unscriptural manner. And they're not authorized to marry another person. And because of that, they may stay single and be the single among us. So that's another reason why they may not. Another one is because their spouse has passed away. And when you think about someone and their spouse passing, the kinds of divided loyalty, I guess, would be that those may suffer through with that is something that's beyond my ability to really comprehend. Because there are people that I know of that's been married 30, 40, 50, 60 years, and they lose a spouse. And then the idea of possibly entertaining the idea of getting married again is so beyond their comprehension, because there's no desire to be with another person in their life. Again, Paul does not say, and the Bible does not condemn, if they do remarry, they have done nothing wrong and they have not sinned against their former spouse or God himself. However, for some, they stay single because they don't want to remarry after they've lost their spouse. It's too difficult for them. The truth be told, that every marriage usually ends naturally, ends because one of the spouses dies before the other, which means all of us who are married, one of us is probably going to have to say goodbye to the other first. And that's a heartbreaking moment. And for that to be the reality, there's some people who don't want to ever face that kind of thing ever again because of how hard and difficult it is. And so again, if we are of the mindset that a person has to get married, has to have someone that they're looking at marrying, it's just not scriptural. And it's something we need to be very, very careful with when it comes to our singles, and never, ever belittle those who make these choices. But with those who are single, it does come with some very, very unique challenges. One of them is, and one of the things that Paul addresses very first in 1 Corinthians 7, is the idea of controlling sexual desires. Notice in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, we're going to read verses 2 and 3 first. We're picking up in the middle of the context. But Paul says, "Nevertheless, because of sexual immorality, let each man have his own wife, and let each woman have her own husband. Let the husband render to his wife the affection due her, and likewise also the wife to her husband." Verses 7 through 9, he continues by saying, "For I wish that all men were even as myself, but each one has his own," notice how he terms this, "his own gift from God, one in this manner and another in that. But I say to the unmarried and to the widows, it is good for them if they remain, even as I am. But if they cannot exercise self-control, let them marry, for it is better to marry than to burn with passion." And so Paul recognizes that it's a very unique situation you find yourself in, and it is a challenge. But notice that Paul says that some do have the gift of being able to control themselves very much and very well. Paul says, I wish that people were like me so that they weren't concerned about that. Can you imagine being someone like Paul who's traveling all over the world and he's got his wife back home and he never gets to see her, he never gets to be with her? And on top of that, Paul is out here preaching and teaching, and there are people who are trying to add afflictions to Paul's chains by preaching the gospel for pretense, trying to cause him to be under further persecution. And then his wife is back here, and who knows what someone may plan to do to him and his family if that were the case. That would be very difficult for Paul. But Paul recognizes that not everyone is going to be able to have that type of a gift of self-control. And so because of that, if a person needs to marry, let them marry, because it's better to marry than to burn with passion. And Paul recognizes that. We mentioned Hebrews 13, verse 4 numerous times yesterday, that says that the marital bed is undefiled. Fornicators and adulterers, God will judge. And so the single person needs to recognize, and they probably already do, and need prayers and need support in recognizing sexual desires and how to conquer them. One of the things that we've also been asked as an eldership to look at is about some teaching along this that can help some of our young people in conquering these desires and looking past the things of the flesh to maintain their purity in the midst of a world that does not want them to. That shows just how good-minded and good-hearted our young people are and how much support they need from us. These struggles are real. And we remember, those of us who are married, we remember how those struggles are. And so we need to be supportive of them. The Song of Solomon, chapter 8, verse 4, there's a part of that verse that says you don't awaken love before it's time. In other words, and she seems to be talking to her friends about don't encourage these things to happen until the time is right for them to happen. We live in a hyper-sexualized society. TV, radio, magazines, jokes, conversations, hyper-sexualized. And our young people need to have this same heart that the Song of Solomon is talking about. Do not awaken it before it's time. Stay away from those kinds of conversations. Stay away from those types of settings so that you can maintain your purity and your integrity. Also, another unique challenge is that avoiding idleness. One thing that I've heard people say that when they first get married, that the husband sometimes is the one that's particularly prone to this. Video games. That when you're single, playing video games, staying up, all hours of the night, playing video games and online with other people playing these games and stuff like that may be a part of your normal routine. When you get married, that is not supposed to keep going on. It's usually frowned upon, let's put it that way. Idleness is a real thing. That just because you're single does not mean that your life is supposed to be filled with idleness. Because we all know what happens with idleness. 1 Timothy 5 is an outstanding chapter to study. And I would encourage our young people to go through that chapter and really look at that from the perspective of the one that is single. Because it's not just about the one, and it's particularly not about the one who is single because they've grown up and not yet married, as much as it is someone who did marry and at a very young age became a widow. And Paul says that the church is not supposed to take this person under the charge, in other words, pay them for their support so that they don't have to work, because if you do that, they're going to become idle, gossips, busybodies. That is inappropriate. How many people you know have gotten in trouble because they spend way too much time on the internet? Chat rooms. I don't even know if that's still a thing. I know years ago the chat rooms was a big thing. But now with the Twitter and Facebook and Insta Chatagram or whatever it is, how many people gotten in trouble because they've got way too much time on their hands? It's interesting that when you think about the virtuous woman of Proverbs 31, that even though she's married, she still makes sure she is not idle. Because it's a great blessing when women do not have to go into the workforce and be outside the home. What a great blessing that is. But it's also something that's a double-edged sword, because they can also become idle. So idleness is a very real thing that singles need to make sure that you're avoiding. Be careful with that. Find yourself some industry. Find yourself some purpose to serve others. One big thing, and I think this is what a lot of people suffer from, is when they're facing these challenges, is loneliness. Genesis 2 verse 18 says, "It was not good for man to be alone." Companionship is something that the Bible promotes from beginning to end. The marriage feast of the Lord is talked about in the Gospels. And in the end, the bride coming down adorned as a bride prepared for her husband is presented as being the ultimate culmination of everything that we've been looking forward to in this life. And so this companionship is a very real thing. 1 Kings chapter 19, you see Elijah after he has vanquished the prophets of Baal. And he's on the run from Jezebel. And he goes out into the wilderness. And he's in a mountain and he's out there by himself, lonely. And he tells God, "I wish you would just take my life now because I'm the only one." He felt all alone, that there was no one else. And God had to remind him that you're not all alone. First and foremost, the Lord was with him and provided for him and helped him along the way. But even more than that, the Lord had provided several hundred more servants that he could lean upon. And plus Elisha was on his way to take up his mantle. But that loneliness is real, where a person feels like a thick darkness, the loneliness. A person feels and can almost hear that there's no one else there. And that loneliness is something that can very much destroy people. Because in that loneliness, when you start listening to your own voice, sometimes you create your own self-doubt about your worth and your value and your purpose. And what's the use? And none of those things are coming from the Lord. Those are the times that we need companionship. And those are the times that we need to realize that we are truly not alone. Because in those times like February 14th, for many people it's a day of celebration. For others it's a day of loneliness. Or it's a day of remembering what it used to be like. You begin to think, well, how are other people looking at me? And then you start to look at yourself the same way that you think others are. It's a lonely feeling from time to time, and it is a challenge that our young people deal with. And there's a lot of other practical considerations. You think about the one who is widowed or divorced and how it was that maybe they were a 2-income family, now they're only a 1-income family. Or they're in a situation where the children are not with them all the time because of visitations and having to pick them up and not spending the holidays with one another and all the frustrations that would go along with that. And you can understand just how devastating it can be upon a person. That the practical considerations are real because there's many that do face these kinds of things. Some people have to wear both hats in a relationship of raising children, and it's a difficult thing. So our singles do face a lot of very, very unique challenges. But not everything is doom and gloom, because Paul does, as I said, present being single as actually a special blessing in 1 Corinthians chapter 7. Because one of the things that comes with that, Paul says, is there's one thing that's worse than wishing you were married, and that's wishing you weren't. When you look around the audience when that statement is read, the only thing worse than wishing you were married is wishing you weren't. There's some people that is kind of comical in a way, and that's understandable. But there were a whole lot of head nods when that was being read. If you think being single is tough, be married to the wrong person, quote unquote, wrong person. The Bible is filled with this idea as well. In Proverbs 21, it's not very flattering of these types of relationships. Proverbs 21, there's two statements in Proverbs 21 that I want you to look at. Proverbs 21 and verse 9, first off. Proverbs 21 and verse 9 says, "It's better to dwell in the corner of a housetop than in the house shared with a contentious woman." In verse 19 of Proverbs 21, if that weren't enough, he says in verse 19, "Better to dwell in the wilderness," or in the desert, some versions may say, "than with a contentious and angry woman." The only thing worse than wishing you were married is wishing you weren't. There was a man that I knew that to this day he is still, hands down, no competition, best Bible student I ever met in my life. He was so very knowledgeable of the Scriptures. And he was married to a woman that by all accounts was a great and wonderful wife. That she was a good spouse to him, and they were a great partnership in that marriage. And he served as an elder for many, many years in that relationship. And I think they were married for 46 or 48 years, and then she passed away. And for him, and I asked him one time about why he made this decision, because after about 12 weeks, he remarried. He remarried very quickly. And it was horrible from that point to the day he died. And I asked him why it was that he had married so quickly. And he said to him, there was nothing in life that was better than being married. And he said, now I've learned differently, that there is nothing worse in life than marrying the wrong person. Proverbs presents this picture because it is a special warning to be careful. Don't just rush into marriage because you think it's expected of you, or because you just want to have companionship, or just because you want to get married. Don't rush into it. Make sure that the person you marry is the right person. Make sure that God is their first priority. Make sure that they are going to put God first in their life. Make sure that they are the kind of person that God himself would approve of in a marriage. You go through the scriptures and you have someone like Ahab and Jezebel. You think about someone like the prophet Hosea and Gomer, the prostitute. You have Abigail, and then you got her husband, the fool, Nabal. And these marriages have all these problems and difficulties in them. And so the special blessing that you have is that you have not made that mistake yet. Please do not make it. Because as I said, the only thing worse than wishing you were is wishing you weren't. That's a hard place to be in. But one of the things because you're spared from some of the troubles that come with marriage. Back in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, we're going to read through several of these verses one more time. And being spared from the troubles of marriage. Notice how Paul talks about these things. And again, in verse 26, he is saying right there in the middle of that verse, because of the present distress. That's why he's writing about these things. He says, now concerning virgins, I have no commandment from the Lord, yet I give judgment as one whom the Lord in his mercy has trusted and made trustworthy. I suppose, therefore, that this is good because of the present distress, that it is good for a man to remain as he is. Are you bound to a wife? Do not seek to be loosed. Are you loosed from a wife? Do not seek a wife. But even if you do marry, you have not sinned, or if a virgin marries, she has not sinned. Nevertheless, such will have trouble in the flesh, but I would spare you. But this I say, brethren, the time is short, so that from now on, even those who have wives should be as those who had none. Those who weep as those who did not weep, and those who rejoice as those who did not rejoice. Those who buy as those who did not possess, and those who use this world as not misusing it. Some of your versions may say, or using it up completely. For the form of this world is passing away, but I want you to be without care. Some of the versions have a different rendering of that particular passage. Free from anxiety, I believe some of the other versions say. The ESV is free from anxieties. He who is unmarried cares about the things of the Lord, how he may please the Lord. But he who is married cares about the things of the world. He's not saying that he is worldly, but the things of this world, how he can please his wife. There is a difference between a wife and a virgin. The unmarried woman cares about the things of the Lord, that she may be holy both in body and spirit. But she who is married cares about the things of this world, how she may please her husband. And this I say for your own profit, not that I may put a leash on you, but for what is proper, and that you may serve the Lord without distraction. There's a lot of distractions that married people do have because of the responsibilities that are placed upon them. This adds not a better layer, but it adds complexity. It doesn't make the married better and the unmarried less, or the unmarried better and the married less. It just puts an extra layer of complexity upon the relationships. But because of where you're at, Paul says that you don't have to have these troubles that come with being married. And that is a blessing. That is something used to your advantage. Here's some really good years for you to learn how to do some things before you ever enter into relationships. You can learn how to be a good wife, how to be a good mother, even before you ever become one. You can learn how to teach Bible classes and how to deal with other things within the church that are within the purview that you find yourself in, because you have that opportunity and you don't have to answer or come back home at a certain time and meet the responsibilities of a spouse or with a household. Those are things that you can take advantage of now. And Paul says that because of the stress that was going on, you're free to move around and to free yourself from these burdens. So Paul says be careful with that and use it effectively to the glory of God. Paul describes it again as being like a gift. And you can have that focused devotion and availability. 1 Corinthians 7, verse 8, Paul says, but I say to the unmarried and to the widows, it is good for them to remain even as I am. So he tells them that it's better for them to remain as he is. And this is why, verses 32 and 33 again, so that you don't have, so that you can be without anxiety. The unmarried cares about the things of the Lord, how he may please the Lord. So too are unmarried. For whatever reason you're in that state. Does that describe you? Not yet married. Maybe you don't want to be. Maybe one day you do want to be. You find yourself because of an unscriptural divorce or because you've been widowed, and you find yourself among the unmarried. Has that become now your number one focus and concern? If you want to make it through these times, if you want to be strong, and what we need to encourage our young people to do and our unmarried to do is to focus your devotion and your availability on serving God. Let it be that you never make the choice that the things of this world are more important than the things of God. Amen. Because you have a special blessing right now that the married have to contend with. And that is choosing a spouse, choosing their children over the Lord. And it may very well be in this present time that there were some who were deciding to follow their ungodly, their unbelieving spouse back into the world rather than lose them because of the persecution. And that's a real choice that some of them were having to make. That would be devastating to have to make. You've seen how many times it is that there's been someone who's preached and taught the truth for year after year and decade after decade, and then all of a sudden, because of something that has happened in their family, they've all of a sudden changed the things they teach and preach. That's what Paul's talking about. That's something you don't have to contend with, that you're blessed to not have to contend with. Learn to shore up your faith now, so that when the day comes that if you ever decide to get married, that you have already set your mind on the direction you're going to go, no matter who it is that you decide to marry. And it needs to be something very, very clear in the relationships that you have with others, what your true devotion is. I told you that Angie let me know very quickly that she loved God a lot more than she loved me. And I did not like it when I heard it. I appreciate it a whole lot now, but I did not like it at the very beginning. Thank God that she had determined that before I ever entered the picture. Because that's what we're supposed to do. Amen. That's the kind of faith we're supposed to have. So Paul is not trying to put more of a burden, but to free from anxiety. So let's encourage our young people as much as we can. And to our young people, be patient, be content. 1 Corinthians 7:29-31 once again talks about from this time on, be as though you did not even have a spouse. Paul says that in that time, you almost have to develop that mindset because of what's going on. Paul also said to the Philippian brethren, Philippians 4 and verse 11, that in whatever state he found himself, he knows how to be content. He has learned to be content. The level of contentment and self-control and discipline that you are developing, even at the ages that you are now, or for whatever reason you're not married, those are things that take a lot of willpower, a very well-trained conscience, some knowledge of God's Word, and a heart that's devoted to the Lord Himself. That's something that all of us could benefit from. Even as Paul himself says that he had learned to be content in whatever state he found himself. Also, don't be defined by your marital status. Colossians 2 and verse 10 says that you are all in Christ. You're fulfilled in Christ. Your marital status does not define you. It does tonight, okay? But ordinarily it does not define you. Don't let others define you by that either. Be proud of whatever place you find yourself and the abilities that God has given to you. Use them for His glory. And also, you may not have a spouse, but rather you do have a family. Hebrews 2 and verse 11 is one of my favorite verses, where part of that verse says that He is not ashamed to call them brethren. The verse has always impressed me, that Jesus Himself is not ashamed to call me one of His brethren. We are a family not just with one another, but with the Lord Himself. And in 1 Timothy 4, 16 and 17, you remember that Paul talked about how it was that he felt neglected and forsaken by so many. 2 Corinthians 4, 16 and 17. He says, at my first offense, no one stood with me, but all forsook me. May it not be charged against them. But then in verse 17, he says, but the Lord stood with me and strengthened me, so that the message might be preached fully through me and all the Gentiles might hear. Also, I was delivered out of the mouth of the lion. That he says that even though everyone else had forsaken him, the Lord had not. As I said, being unmarried does not mean that you are less or unfulfilled. It means there's a lot of things from you that we can learn and should learn. And we should encourage you as much as we can along the way. So the question I'm going to leave with all of us is how can you use your present status, no matter where you're at, married, unmarried, to the greatest impact for God's kingdom? Because this year we've been talking about being kingdom citizens. And you are no less one of God's kingdom citizens than anybody else. You need to be uplifted. You need to be encouraged. And you need to be strengthened. There's so much that you can contribute. Make sure that you are. If we can help you in any way, if you need to study about these things further, if there's some other questions you might have about this, if there's some things that you want to work out, let us know. We want to sit down and study with you, pray with you, encourage you however we can. If someone needs to obey the gospel, to be baptized so that your sins may be washed away and rise to walk in the newness of life, we want to help you in whatever way we can. As we stand and sing, please come if we can be of service.